So I think we can get started. Welcome to the RTA Strategic Plan Movers Workshop, everyone. Please continue to go ahead and put your name and organization or affiliation in the chat. And Melissa, if you can go to the next slide. Thanks. All right, well, welcome everyone. Good morning. My name is Tina Fassett-Smith. I'm the Director of Communications at the RTA. We're here today to invite you to be a part of the development of the next Regional Transit Strategic Plan. The goal of our workshop is to provide you with an update of what we've heard in our initial period of public engagement and to gain your valuable input. Next slide. So our agenda for today, first, an introduction. I'll talk about why the RTA is doing this strategic plan and turn it over to other RTA staff to give an update on what we've heard over the last 6 months and describe an emerging vision of where we're headed here. Thanks. Then we'll break out into smaller facilitated groups to further engage in discussion. We'll then come back as a group and go through some live polling related to some desired outcomes. And finally, we'll provide an update of where we're headed next. During our workshop today, you're going to hear from RTA staff from our planning, finance, and communications team, as well as Lyndon Valicenti from Daylight, who has supported our engagement efforts. So I'm going to start, I'm sorry, next slide, Melissa. Thanks. I'm going to start out by describing briefly who the RTA is. The RTA was created by the state of Illinois to coordinate the Chicago region's transit system, oversee its financing with transparency and accountability, and plan for a future with adequate, accessible, and equitable public transportation for the 6 counties of northeastern Illinois. So that means the RTA's role is first to coordinate regional transit. The Chicago region is home to one of the largest transit systems in the country. Pre-COVID, that meant we served nearly 2 million riders each weekday via 3 separate agencies, CTA, Metra, and PACE, each with their own boards, budgets, and staffs operating transit. The RTA's role is as a convener and to foster collaboration between all 4 agencies. Another part of that mission is to oversee financing of regional transit with transparency and accountability. We work with the transit agencies to develop budgets and financial forecasts and to conduct regular monitoring to ensure major capital projects are happening on time and on budget. This responsibility was a key driver of our current strategic plan, Invest in Transit, which argued for sustainable funding and was part of the successful effort to see a new state capital bill passed. The third part of the RTA's mission is to plan for the future, which is primarily what we're here to talk about today. Next. If everyone could go ahead and mute themselves, there'll be a time later when you can unmute and talk, but for now, I appreciate it, thanks. Our rule requires that we develop a strategic plan for the region's system every 5 years. The development for the next regional strategic plan will follow 3 tracks. The first track is financial planning. This track includes the development of the 2022 and 2023 regional operating and capital budgets, and it will analyze potential funding scenarios over 10 years to prepare the region and our decision makers for needed future actions to ensure financial sustainability. This track will culminate in a 10-year financial plan. Simultaneously, the strategic planning track will provide a forum for conversations about the trade-off between visionary ideals and funding realities, resulting in a new vision for our regional transit system. This track will also identify the capital projects and other supporting elements needed to achieve that vision. At the end of this year, deliverables from these 2 tracks will be combined to create a regional transit strategic vision and 10-year financial plan. Underlying these activities and continuing through implementation will be a communication and engagement track, which will ensure that all our audiences, all of you, remain informed about this process, that we're continuously seeking your input, and that we're building the capacity for ourselves and all of you and other stakeholders to implement this adopted plan. Our next big milestone is to present to the public and to the RTA board our findings from our initial engagement activities, which will include today's workshop, and to submit this emerging vision to the public for further feedback. Next slide. The RTA launched its initial Making a Plan engagement efforts for this plan in August, and I want to just describe some of the activities briefly. We've published a series of guest posts on Connections, the RTA blog, for more than a dozen transit thinkers and leaders across the region. Just yesterday, we published posts from the leaders of all 3 service boards, and so I'd encourage you to look at those. Additionally, the RTA board has welcomed speakers each month to present on a range of topics related to this work, including representatives from the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, who just completed their own strategic plan, the Shared Use Mobility Center, and SEPTA, which is a peer transit agency to the RTA operating in Philadelphia. In November, the RTA and the Urban Transportation Center at the University of Illinois Chicago hosted a panel discussion with experts from Lake County Partners, the Transit Equity Network, and Transit Center to discuss how we might rethink regional transit. We currently have a public survey out that over 1,000 people have taken, including many of you. We've held and are holding multiple stakeholder workshops, including this one, and will continue to do so throughout the plan's development. Additionally, there'll be working groups led by RTA staff, sorry, that's my cat, led by RTA staff and including external stakeholders tasked with providing policy guidelines on specific plan elements. Now I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Peter Kirsten, to walk through our initial findings from these engagement activities. Thank you.
Thanks, Tina, and thank you all for being here today with us. Again, my name is Peter Kirsten. I'm a strategic planner with the RTA. And the following is input we received from all of the making a plan engagement activities that Tina was showing on the previous slide. Our engagement consultant, Daylight, has aided us in parsing these different streams of input into digestible content that we can group and organize under themes, ideas. For clarity, we'll present the findings in the format we asked the question, which focused on key areas of opportunities for impact, system adaptation, funding, and equity. As we're going through this, be thinking about what here is urgent, what has potential for positive impact, and what can the RTA truly take on? What does the agency have capacity to act on in the next 5 years? Next slide. So first, a little bit more about the survey. This was developed with Daylight, promoted through social media channels, including plugs by all the service boards. The public survey has garnered a significant response, quite a bit more than we anticipated, with over 1,000 responses and people that began the survey at 97% completion rate. Next slide. The survey does ask people's affiliation, and over 75% of the people that have taken the survey have identified as either a transit rider or member of the general public, with the other 25% being a mix of different professional groups. Many of you belong to local governments, service board staff, elected officials, etc. Next slide. So one of the first things we asked in the survey is how people describe their vision of the future of the region's transit system. This was in a free text field. So visualized here on the screen is a word cloud of responses that we received, and the size of the word corresponds with how many times we heard it. So the visual shows frequent, reliable, safe, accessible and accessibility, fast, efficient, all rise to the top in terms of what people envision for our system. Next slide. So the first topic area is opportunities for impact. And kind of the overriding question that we asked here is, what is the greatest opportunity for impact that the strategic plan process should address? Next slide. So first, in the survey response, the number one answer that we heard across the board and represented in the blue bar on your screen here is that the RTA should invest in a state of good repair for the transit system, strengthening the region's broader transportation system. So continuing very much so with the efforts of our previous strategic plan, Invest in Transit. I'm not going to go through all the answers for time. The full survey responses will be released with board materials that will come out in February. So if you're interested, you can certainly share more. Next slide. So same question, opportunities for impact, but what did we hear in terms of the more unstructured feedback? So this would include blog posts and guest speakers to the board, workshops, not dissimilar from this one. We heard a lot. We heard about climate. We heard about climate in terms of mode shift and transit as a tool to reduce the impact of private automobiles have on the environment, reducing greenhouse gases, VMT and particulate matter. Also reducing the impacts of auto-oriented development and land uses. We heard about taking a rider-centered approach, make transit more available and easy to use across the entire system. We heard a lot about communicating, assessing and communicating outcomes, being transparent in planning and in process, and prioritizing communities of greatest need and really centering their voices. We heard about new ways to articulate the value of transit. Ridership is not the most or only important metric, but how else do we need to be defining the value that transit brings to the region? We also heard about the climate in terms of resilience and advancing green transit initiatives. This includes fleet electrification, as well as building a network that is more resilient to climate change impacts, such as extreme weather. Next slide. So the second topic area is transit system adaptation. And the overriding question we heard asked here is, what types of system changes should be made the focus of this process? Next slide. So first, the survey response. Again, I'm just going to share the top answer. The blue bar, creating a more flexible transit system that better serves destinations outside of downtown Chicago and outside of the traditional AM and PM commuting hours. Next slide. So again, now the unstructured feedback we heard in blogs, guest speakers. There's a lot here. More about adaptation and flexibility, coordination between the service boards, aligning schedules and service patterns, making transfers easier. We heard about fares in terms of integrating, also in terms of discounts aimed at people that could benefit most from them. We heard a lot about safety and security, ensuring that everyone who rides on transit feels safe at all times. We heard about mobility management, first and last mile solutions, community development and equitable transit-oriented development, economic growth and how transit can contribute to the region's competitiveness, regional business partnerships, reliability and quality of service, physical expansion, new projects, how do we aim for the future? And then lastly, speed, particularly in terms of congested corridors and automation. Next slide. So the third topic area is funding stability. And the overriding question we asked here is, which key financial issues should be addressed through this process? Next slide. So first, the survey questions. We asked this in a couple ways. This question here is very specific. In the future, if COVID relief funding runs out before ridership fully recovers, the transit system should blank. So keep in mind that the RTA system relies heavily on fares. So as ridership is struggling, that has a significant impact on operational revenue. Far and away, the response we've received the most interest is to pursue additional funding sources for transit. Next slide. So then a second survey question around funding. The question here is, how should the RTA focus its efforts in addressing funding? We offered responses here in terms of capital investment, operating funds, and weighing kind of the trade-offs between service levels and what funds will be available. And then the third option is seeking new revenue sources. And far and away, again, seek new revenue sources was the most popular answer in the survey, with capital investment being the second most popular and operating funding being the third. Next slide. So then in terms of unstructured feedback, so again, workshops, blog posts, etc. We heard about changing funding distribution, moving away from historic formulas. We heard about relying less on fares and just rethinking fares and funding generally, finding sources of funding that are more resilient in terms of funding the critical network. We heard about new funding sources. We heard about leveraging partnerships. A lot of this topic is stuff RTA can't do on its own, something we'll need to work with stakeholders throughout the region to advance. We heard again about communicating the value of transit, not just in terms of riders and fares, but what value transit brings to the region. We heard about investing in terms of state of good repair, in terms of rethinking priorities, and in terms of finding more and new ways to invest. We heard about funding parity, ensuring that funding for public transportation options are robust across our diverse region. As well, we heard about controlling costs and anticipating what may be coming and ensuring that we are good stewards of the funds that we have. And then we heard about road pricing and looking to roads or tolling as a source for transit funding. Next slide. So the last topic area is equity. And the overriding question we asked here are, what are some productive ways for the RTA to define, understand, and incorporate equity during this planning process. Next slide. So again, survey response here. Far and away, the most popular answer was to leverage transit's inherent advantage towards equitable mobility by advocating for increased federal and state transit funding. Next slide. So then in terms of the more unstructured feedback, equity is ingrained in so many other topics that are covered in this engagement. Fair integration, fair discounts are an equity issue, job access, and the distribution of service across the region is an equity issue. So some specific comments that we got through unstructured engagement platforms were to operationalize a racial equity lens, to establish goals and performance measures for equity, to prioritize access to those who need it most, identifying these groups through things like income, employment, and communities of color. We heard about equity in the transit system starts with a strong system. So this kind of gets back to that funding parity point, transit being inherently a more equitable mode in comparison to highways and private auto. We heard about providing robust service throughout the region, not just to the central business core. We heard about acknowledging history of structural racism and the inequitable outcomes of the region's transportation system. And then we heard a lot about considering low income and communities of color beyond just Cook County and the city of Chicago. Equity is a regional issue. We can't lose sight of that. Next slide. So with that in mind, we'll now begin the interactive format of this workshop. And I will pass it over to Jessica to begin the next area.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Peter. Good morning, everybody. I am Jessica Hector, so I'm the Director of Planning and Market Development here at RTA. And thank you so much for joining us. I'm just struck by all the people who are on this call and all the great perspectives that we're going to have for this conversation. So what we have done as staff is we've taken all of that rich feedback and we've actually started to produce some of the starting contents of the plan. And we're going to spend the bulk of today's workshop talking about those with you and getting your feedback on what you see there and what you think we can add and tweak before we present it to our board, as Tina mentioned in February. So we've created three things. We've gone ahead and taken the feedback and created a vision, which we'll talk about in a minute. And the vision really describes why we do what we do. You know, transit isn't an end, it's a means to an end. So what's that end that we're aiming for? We've also taken the feedback to develop what we call 3 principles that are going to talk about how we do what we do and really overarching ideas that will span topics and the contents of the plan. And then third, we're going to talk about some outcomes. You know, we really don't want this plan to be something that sits on a shelf. We want it to spur action. And so we're turning traditional planning upside down and we're saying, let's start with the outcomes and let's have you help us think about what those outcomes should be. And then we'll work backwards and talk about how to get there. So today we're going to spend our time talking about all 3 of those things. Let's go to the next slide and I'll share our vision with you. So we've developed a vision based on the feedback and that word cloud that PK shared, and I'll read it for you a couple of times. Healthy, connected people and communities that are empowered by safe, reliable, and affordable public transportation for all. So I'm going to read that one more time. Healthy, connected people and communities that are empowered by safe, reliable, and affordable public transportation for all. So now that you've had a chance to see that, we want to ask you a few questions. So first, we're going to have a poll that's going to pop up, and we're going to ask you to tell us kind of what parts of that vision really resonate with you. Which pieces of it really speak to what you are thinking about and what you're working on. So you'll see a poll pop up, and you can go ahead and check one of the answers and submit. And Melissa, who is our poller here, is going to tell us when she closes the poll, and we're all going to see what the responses look like. Seeing a lot of
I give everyone another couple seconds to answer. Close the poll in another 5 seconds or so.
All right, have we closed the poll, Melissa?
Yes.
Yes, so everyone should see the final responses up there on the screen. It looks like almost half of you, or slightly more than half of you, said that safe, reliable, and affordable public transportation is what really stood out to you. We also saw that public transportation for all and healthy connected communities got quite a few responses as well. So thank you for that feedback. Let's talk for a minute about it. I'd like to ask you in the chat to write in there, I see people actually already doing this, but go ahead and write in there some specific feedback on parts of that that resonated with you, or maybe things that are missing from it that you'd really like to see in there. And if we'd ask anybody who wants to write that in the chat. And if you'd like to speak up and share too, we have a few minutes where we can hear from some people. If you'd like to raise your hands, we'll call on you and you can speak to the group as well. So I'm seeing some responses come in. I saw some people actually before we started this, before we asked the question, mentioning that they'd like to see climate friendly language about environmental benefits. We'd like to see some folks, Lori mentioned she'd like to see accessible added. Adam said that as well. Leah likes that we put the emphasis on people first and would encourage also adding climate and accessibility. So we're hearing a lot about that. Kevin says healthy seems beyond the scope of RTA. We've heard that actually in a couple of other workshops that we've been doing. Kevin, do you want to speak up and share a little bit about why that might be, why that struck you as something outside the scope of transit?
Yeah, I mean, to start with the obvious, of course, I support healthy people, the notion of healthy people, but healthy people seems to be well beyond transit. Healthy people is about access to healthcare, nutrition, disease management, lots of other things that are well beyond the scope of transit.
Interesting points. Yeah. We're thinking about that and thinking about how to capture all of that again as a transit as a means to that end, not as the means itself, or not as the end itself, I should say. But that's good feedback. I think I saw someone else raise their hand. Ariane, maybe you raised your hand a minute ago. Did you want to share something?
Yes, hi, my name is Arjen van Andel. Yeah, I was basically having the same question on that healthy, that it doesn't give the impression that it's just for healthy people. I mean, you probably want to have like healthy connections and healthy support, like healthy options and maybe healthy choices. But I mean, I thought that you want to make sure that it is for everyone, and that people might not feel like this is for healthy people, so to say.
Thank you for that feedback. Okay, that's really good feedback to not use healthy in a way that sounds exclusionary. That's definitely feedback that we'll take to heart. Amy, do you want to add something as well? I think you might be muted, Amy. It looks like you're speaking, but we can't hear you.
Unmute. Okay. I started to say that that was the option that I didn't choose because initially I thought about what the two previous speakers raised, and or one of you raised about the healthy part being outside the purview maybe of the RTA. But actually, the more I think about it, in terms of access to affordable and reliable public transportation, a lot of people need to rely on it to get to their sources of health care, their medical visits and things like that. So I do see a connection with that. Maybe the phrasing of it could be a little bit clearer, but I can see a connection with people maintaining their health because they're easily able to get to their doctors or medical providers.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all of that. Yes, well said, and something that we're definitely thinking about. I see a lot of people commenting on in the chat about, thank you, by the way, for all of these. We'll be sure to capture these, even if we're not able to talk about them live in the meeting. But I see a lot of people talking about connectedness and how do you define connections and connectedness. Would anyone like to speak up about that subject, this idea of what it means to be connected? Anybody want to speak to connectedness? Let's see if I'm getting any more in the chat on that. Paula says connected number of segments needed to get from A to B. So looking at how seamless, yeah, some other people saying looking at how seamless things are and what they're connecting to. All right, all great points. So thank you so much. This is all really good feedback. We will think about those words and think about what they mean and if they're expressing what we hope that they should express, and take that under advisement as we take this forward to the board. Let's move on to talking about our principles. Principles, we thought it was important to state some principles because we got a lot of feedback that wasn't about what we're doing, but about how we do what we do and the kind of attitude with which we are approaching all of these topics. And so we thought it was important to state those going into it. So the 3 principles that we've outlined are shown here, and we're gonna break up into groups and talk about them in a minute, but I wanna explain each of them to you first. The first is open to change. We know that many elements of the transit system work very well, and people tell us all of the time that they are grateful for it and that we generally have good customer satisfaction ratings. But we also heard a lot during the input season about the need to change things, not change everything, but change some things that aren't working well for everybody. And so we think it's important for us as agencies and for the communities and stakeholders with which we work to come to the table open to change here. Not about specific changes necessarily, but just with an attitude of being open to change. The second is equity. We heard, as PK mentioned, a lot about equity and equity in many different topic areas. And RTA has a legislative mandate to look at geographic equity specifically. So we have done that historically. We will continue to do that. However, there are many other ways to think about equity and to look at equity, both for communities that have historically been left out of an equity conversation, as well as new communities that are forming throughout the region that have equity challenges. And so what we want to be able to talk about equity across race, across job types, across abilities, across time of day in which we're working, again, across working and non-working status. And so we want to think about those things, and we want to make sure that we approach all of the topics of the strategic plan asking ourselves, is what we're recommending equitable, or are there people who are being left out? The third is stewardship. And we also have a mandate to adopt balanced budgets for our agencies. It's something that we do every year, and it's something that we're proud of and we think is important. It's also a challenging time to be talking about that in transit space because we do have financial challenges, and we will have financial challenges coming. So we want to make sure that we're being good stewards of the funding that we have, and that we're also not creating a plan that is not grounded in that reality, that we do have fiscal responsibility, that we do have fiscal limitations that we have to live within, and we can pursue additional funding, and that may be part of what we decide to do, but that always has to be balanced with the reality of the fact that we are a publicly subsidized entity that has limitations. So those are our 3 principles. What we're going to do now is we're going to break you up into smaller groups to talk about them and talk about what they mean in a little bit more detail, and to share your thoughts about how you think we should approach those 3. We are going to be in those groups for about 25 minutes, and then we'll come back and Melissa will walk us through the plan outcomes that I mentioned earlier, and we'll talk through outcomes. But for now, we're going to break out into those groups. I am going to hand it over to Lyndon Vellicenti, who's going to walk us through the tools that we'll be using in those breakout sessions to collect your feedback. So up to you, Lyndon.
Great, thank you, Jessica. As Jessica mentioned, we're about to break off into smaller group discussions around those 3 principles. I'm here to just offer a little bit of an orientation to the tool that one of the tools we'll use to capture your input and ideas. We'll be using Jamboard, which is a virtual whiteboard tool. And once you land into your breakout groups after clicking join, we will, your breakout facilitator will share a Jamboard link in the chat. This will be your breakout room shared virtual whiteboard space, and you'll be able to see each other's contributions to this space. And again, we'll use this to document your input. How it works is once you're there, there's a toolbar on the left-hand side. You'll see the arrow icon. This is your cursor for moving things around and clicking on things. The box just beneath it with the two lines is your sticky note tool. And so you'll click on that, add your great idea, hit save, and you'll see it populate in the upper left-hand corner. Using your cursor, you can move that around, resize that sticky note. As we move through the conversation, we'll have a couple of Jamboard frames. At the top toolbar, you'll see a series of frames or squares with an arrow to the right, and that will help you advance the Jamboard according to the conversation. If you have any questions or need any technical assistance as part of this, feel free to come back to the main room where Melissa from RTA will be to sort of troubleshoot with you. With that, we will break off into our breakout rooms.
If anyone here is having trouble joining your breakout room, let me know. Are any of you having trouble joining a breakout room? I can resend an invitation or. Recording the meeting.
This meeting is being recorded.
And that there is a live transcript available in the meeting if anyone needs it through Zoom's auto transcript feature. So my name is Melissa Meyer. I'm a communications specialist at the RTA. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you had productive conversations in your breakout rooms. I am going to lead us through this last section where we're going to talk a little bit more about the outcomes that we have developed to articulate what we've heard people say that they'd like to see come out of this plan. We have people and communities at the center of the vision, but when it comes to outcomes, we are focusing on the region and the transit system, which are both more directly within the RTA and the service board's purviews. The 6 outcomes that we'll talk about are divided into 2 groupings: outcomes and transit system outcomes. These outcomes will be used throughout the process to guide the development of performance measures, goals, and strategies of the plan document. At this point, we are asking ourselves how we will accomplish them. So let's take a look at those outcomes. First, in terms of the region. When we think about outcomes, we are talking about a region of a connected region. So by that, we're asking ourselves, how do we prioritize connecting people who rely on transit the most to opportunities to improve their quality of life? When we talk about a healthy region, we're asking, how do we best leverage transit as a tool for climate action in the region, both in terms of carbon offsets from getting drivers out of cars and into transit, and in terms of greening transit itself through fleet electrification. I think we've heard throughout this meeting that there are a lot of different ways we could think about that word healthy, as far as giving people an opportunity to participate in active transportation, connecting them to health outcomes, and a lot of different things that have to do with the connections between health and public transit. In terms of a region of thriving communities, we're asking, how do we work with communities to ensure that transit is a positive experience in the community through equitable TOD and access improvements? When we talk about outcomes for the system, there are three that we're thinking about right now. The first is a regional transit system that is in a state of good repair and is resilient. And by that, we're asking, how do we invest limited resources to ensure that our transit system is resilient to disruption and to improve the state of good repair? We're also looking at an outcome that would mean a regional transit system that is safe, accessible, reliable, and useful for riders. And by that, we're asking, how do we create a safer, faster, and more seamless rider experience across our regional systems? And finally, we're looking at an outcome that would explore how a regional transit system that is solvent. And by that, we're asking, how do we find new balance in funding for a transit system that is solvent and affordable for taxpayers and riders and powers the region? So we're gonna talk about those outcomes a little bit more and hear from you through some poll questions about those. There'll be 3 poll questions that'll pop up on your screen. The first one, they'll all talk about the same 6 outcomes that I just covered. But we're gonna ask you first, which you think is most important for the region to prioritize. And then we're gonna ask, which do you think will be the most challenging or most contentious for us to achieve? And then we'll wanna hear from you as far as how your work is gonna align with these outcomes and where we could hopefully rely on you to be champions in implementing some of this once the plan process is complete. So I'm gonna launch a poll first here that asks, what is the most important for RTA to prioritize in the next 5 years? And you'll see those 6 outcomes we talked about: a connected region, a healthy region, a region of thriving communities, a regional transit system that is in a state of good repair and resilient, a regional transit system that is safe, accessible, and useful for riders, and a regional transit system that's solvent. And we'll give you guys.
If I could interject a comment, can you hear me? Oh, Melissa, you froze.
We can hear you. Melissa froze.
Okay. Yeah, I'm finding this question as frustrating as I did the poll that went out a few months ago, in that these are inextricably tied to each other. It's, which is more important, the head of the penny or the tail of the penny? I mean, it's one and the same, right? You can't have a well-connected region if it isn't a region that has safe, accessible, and useful transit. You can't get that if it's not in a state of good repair. So asking which of these is more important is a false choice, as was much of the earlier research that went into this.
Thanks for that comment. I'm going to leave the poll open for another couple seconds. All right, we're going to close this poll and take a look at the results. So the outcome that rose to the top as far as the most important for RTA to prioritize in the next 5 years was a regional transit system that is safe, accessible, and useful for riders. And, we have multiple outcomes here because obviously this plan is hopefully going to, we know that, one, that they're all important and a lot of these things are interconnected, and those are the conversations that we're glad to be having with all of you. I'm going to stop sharing those results and we'll jump into the next poll, which is a little more challenging of a question, asking which of these is going to be the most politically or culturally challenging or contentious. So go ahead and take a minute and think about the outcomes and which you think will be the most challenging for the RTA to achieve, the most challenging to get broad support around. Give everyone about 10 more seconds. So the results, which I think should be shared on your screen now, show that the majority of people here think that the most challenging outcome for the RTA to achieve will be regional transit system that is solvent. And I was wondering if anyone wants to speak up or talk about that, why they made that choice or why they voted for that.
This is Adam Ballard from AARP, Illinois. I chose that because I think the reason why I think so many of us chose that is we've been around enough budget fights to know, right, that people just don't want to pay for things, and that in order to get the funding we need or the reallocation of funding we need to make the system work the way we want it to work will take a lot of choices that people who seem to be especially tied to car culture or suburban living might not want to make. And I think it's going to be difficult.
Thanks for sharing that. I see there's another hand up.
Yeah, this is Robert from Active Trans. I used to work at Access Living, so shout out to Adam there and everyone else. I've been using my COVID time to do informal urban transit history research. And it seems like to me that the #1 question that the US has had since the beginning of transit is how in the blankety blank are we going to pay for this? And so that seems to me like the proverbial elephant in the room, as Adam mentioned.
Thanks for sharing. Is there one more hand up before we go to the last question?
Yeah, I didn't vote for regional transit system that is solvent as the most challenging thing. I felt like it was going to be the connected region being the most challenging. And I think the reason for that is very directly related to the solvency issue, because, coming out of COVID and seeing the number of workers who not only prefer to work from home, but are able to, I think it's obvious to everybody we're going to have some tremendous fare box recovery issues coming up, but also, what are our legislators who are supposed to support us in Springfield going to think or do? What are they going to be able to do? What are the legislators in Congress going to be able to think or do, on our behalf? And I think that those upcoming issues are going to drive us apart, because the various counties that support this transit system have somewhat different perspectives on what they think it should look like. And, to me, I feel strongly that that keeping that connectivity, not only in terms of solvency, but also in terms of how we work together to support our transit system in an environment in which a significant number of people are now working from home and no longer commuting, is really going to be a tremendous issue.
Yep. Thank you for sharing that. I am going to launch the last poll here that gets to a little bit of what we've just heard, that the RTA cannot solve all of these issues alone. We need help from many of you across the region, across the state. And so we're asking, which of these outcomes do your organization will be most aligned with and can help us champion?
Alert, audio now unmuted.
and we'll share the results from that poll. And it looks like the most common answer was the regional transit system is safe, accessible, and useful for riders, which is also, I believe, the answer that rose to the top as the one that people said we should prioritize the most. So that is hopefully a lot of effort in that, and I'm sure we'll have plenty more to talk about on all of these outcomes, vision, and principles as we continue in the plan process. So I am going to back over to Tina to talk a little bit about next steps.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you all again for taking time out of your week and out of your day. Our hope is that this was as useful for you as your insights are going to be for us. Your input is invaluable to this work, and again, we really appreciate the time and thought you put into today's workshop. To briefly cover next steps, as we mentioned, our next big milestone is presenting what we heard and where we're headed to the RTA board at the February meeting. In addition to a memo and presentation, there's going to be a concise public-facing document describing these emerging vision and principles that we're going to share with the public and use to spur more engagement. We want to hear more feedback like the feedback that we heard today so that we can make this as strong as possible. Additionally, there'll be other ongoing engagement surveys, virtual events, and of course, all of this will be highlighted on our and covered on our blog, Connections, and in the Regional Transit Update newsletter. If someone could share a link to that in the chat, so everyone, if you're not subscribed, you can subscribe and take a look at it. I also, before we go any further, want to quickly ask Audrey Winnick from MPC to share a link for, there's a great WTS panel happening later today on equity and transportation initiatives that she's taking part in. I just want to give her a chance to share a link for that. I am looking forward to it. So the last thing I want to mention before we, thanks Audrey, before we close today is our working groups. So in addition to the ongoing engagement activities I just mentioned, we're planning to form a series of working groups led and facilitated by our RTA staff and made up of interested stakeholders. We certainly hope there are many of you who want to participate. Each working group will be tied to one of the outcomes we just shared. The focus of each group will be to articulate goals and performance measures related to each outcome that will inform the plan. So for example, the Healthy Region Working Group will articulate goals for how regional transit can work towards climate action and performance measures to capture our progress towards these goals over the course of the 5 years of the plan. Working groups are going to meet regularly beginning in March, and to start, all meetings will be virtual, although we certainly hope there are opportunities to meet in person later this year. If you're interested in joining this effort, there's a link in the chat right now to a Google sign-up form, and we'll also follow up this meeting with an email to all attendees and registrants that will include that form, as well as a copy of the presentation that we gave today. You can sign yourself up, or you can nominate another person or agency that you feel like has expertise to offer that we need to hear from. Depending on the level of response and skills and abilities of the folks that sign up, we may guide compositions of these groups, but each group will be tasked with a single outcome, and participants will only be asked to join one group. Next slide, please. That concludes our workshop. Thank you so much again for your time today. Look for our follow-up email, and we truly appreciate your participation and all of the great feedback that we heard today. Thank you so much.